Hi, friends. Welcome again to another episode of Beyond the Clouds Edge to Edge Transformation. And when we talk about technologies transforming lives, often it's assumed that almost all technologies are geeks with degrees in engineering and all the things that come with it. But every once in a while, we hear from people who started off in the humanities or in liberal arts and are doing amazing work in the industry. Chad, tell us a little bit about you and how you ended up in the tech space from where you started.
Well, thank you for having me on. First of all, it's great to be on the show. And yeah, I started as a journalist. I got my degree in creative writing and journalism. I spent many years abroad writing and doing various ins and outs that you wouldn't expect someone who is currently leading a deep infrastructure data company to do. I eventually made my way back to the US. I got a job in data science. I loved solving problems. I was very good at it. And I was really interested in some of the statistical ramifications that came from data science and experimentation. I eventually wound up at some big companies like Oracle, Sephora, Subway, Microsoft, and then ultimately led the data platform team at a late stage freight technology startup called Convoy. I was there for 3 years where I met the co-founders at my company, Adrian and Daniel, who are both really incredible engineers. And together we formed a team and built a company that's trying to address data quality problems and data governance problems at the source.
Now, Chad, in what ways has your background in deep journalism, creativity, connecting with humans helped you in the formation of this company and all the things that you've done so far?
It has been extraordinarily helpful. So there's a few things that I realized once I rose high enough up the technology ladder, which is that engineers oftentimes struggle a lot to communicate with not just with each other, but also with leadership teams. Leadership often thinks about problems in the macro sense. How is this affecting the business? How is it impacting revenue over long time horizons? Whereas software engineers are usually thinking on the project level. What is this particular project going to do? How interesting is it for me? What does a very technical implementation look like? And I was able to act as a bridge using my communication skills between these two groups. So I thought that a lot of the projects the engineering team worked on could add a lot of value at the executive level, but someone needed to be the translator of that. And that means I had to understand how these engineering systems work so that I could translate it properly. But it went back the other direction as well. So if the business had something that they really focused on and cared about, this is something I've seen all the time, is technology teams will get so frustrated that it's because it seems like executives just don't understand the problems they have. They doesn't understand the solution. They don't understand why we should be investing or in a particular area or resourcing a certain set of projects. And it really all comes down to framing. How well can we communicate our ideas to executive teams using the language that they understand and trying to solve the problems that they cared about? That was my skill set, being able to do that translation, to put it into words, and to be very convincing in the arguments that I made. So I would say there's a lot of amazing things that the humanities did for my career, especially in terms of bringing people together, of having more effective conversations. It took me a really long way, I think, that journalism degree.
I had to learn it the hard way. I had to learn how to communicate well. You could easily have chosen problems that are much easier to understand by the common public, but you decided to go into deep tech like data quality and A/B testing. So, what made you get into these deep tech areas?
I have always been very convinced of the importance of infrastructure. This is a personal belief of mine, but I think that most systemic problems are infrastructure problems in disguise. I think tech debt is real, not just in technology businesses, but I think it's real out in the world. There are decisions that our country or our government or politicians have made 50 years ago or 100 years ago or 200 years ago, and those decisions have serious ramifications that change the way people live and how they work together and how they speak to each other and the types of jobs that are accessible to them. And so building infrastructure from a human first perspective is something that I didn't really see that much when I was first getting into data science and analytics, infrastructure was always seen very much as like, this is a thing that you do. There's a certain amount of steps that you follow. It is incredibly technical, and we don't really need to care about the human aspects of infrastructure. We just need to hire the best engineers that we can to build the most technical product that we can get to make our data move faster, to store as much data as possible. And who really cares how people interface with all of this infrastructure that we've built? But what I would observe in the systems that did that is like, you would have incredibly fast moving data, but nobody would want to access that data because it was too difficult to use. Or you would have an enormous amount of data, massive data volumes, but no one could find the data they needed. So all that data wasn't that useful. And that to me seemed kind of crazy, that we would spend so much effort and energy on the technical components of infrastructure without thinking about the human components. It's kind of like, I'm going to build a road that has the ability to fit 10 million people on it at one time, but I'm not going to build it between two cities that people want to travel between. That is kind of what's happening in data infrastructure today. It seemed like a really exciting challenge to apply that human first mentality.
Many times we don't even think about our end customers. There is a strong belief in the engineering community that as long as the infrastructure is solid, the people who are interested in different verticals, let's say in the mining industry or in the pharmaceutical industry, they will take care of somehow customizing it or verticalizing it. Is that not true? Is there something you can do from the get-go to tune into your customers' needs?
Number one, I think that it might be true in some places, but I usually think that it's unintentionally true, or it's kind of true by luck. But in other areas, I think it needs to be very deliberate. So I'll give you an example of a piece of technology that I think kind of stumbled into really thinking and implementing a human-oriented infrastructure product, which is GitHub. GitHub is one of the most well-used developer tools that exist. It's used for version control. It's used for shipping code of all kinds. I think that GitHub is a beautiful product when it comes to bringing people together. For example, the concept of a pull request is literally a human function. It's, I have made a change and I want another human to review my code and tell me if it looks good or not. And back in the day, I'm sure multiple people on listening right now remember the days of doing in-person code review in a way that was non-federated. You would have to get everybody into a room, and you have to sit in front of a whiteboard, and you'd have to do a big diagram, and you'd have to look at their computers. And it was very costly, and it was very time consuming. And when the industry started making this shift to agile software development, where we're shipping all the time, it meant that code review was just a step that often got left out. And that meant that teams were shipping very low quality code all the time. Well, how did GitHub fix that? Well, they just, in a very opinionated way, made the pull request, the process of code review, a step in the workflow of deploying that code in the first place. So that is a really opinionated product that took a human-oriented approach to bringing people together. They didn't have to do that. They didn't have to say, I'm going to include this concept called the pull request. They could have just said, I'm going to let you deploy as fast as you want, as quickly as you want. You don't have to talk to anybody. But they didn't do that. They deliberately said they wanted to bring people together. I think that's a prime example of how certain really great companies don't just say, here's the infrastructure, go do with it what you want, the verticals would figure it out. They do take a very opinionated approach in how people work together and how they use the product as a team.
How is the quality of overall open source, and how is it self-regulating to give us good products and good solutions over time?
I think that open source products and closed source products have two different value propositions. What open source products are really amazing at is responsiveness to change. Because we have distributed the ownership of these open source products in so many different places, then as the world starts to change, the people who need that open source product to respond to that change can simply use the product, write the code in a very responsive way, and now you've solved the problem. So open source is kind of always shifting and responding to new events. Wikipedia is not sort of an open source, the way you might think of a traditional open source project, but it is open source. It's certainly an open source repository. It's an open source index of information, and we can see how useful it is when responding to new events. It's updated all the time. Larger, bigger companies are not like this. They are much slower to respond to the real world. It takes a much longer time. The feedback loop is much longer. And that's because executives need to get into a room and talk and decide about what to do next. And everybody has to agree. However, what these closed source products are good at is once they decide on a direction, they can funnel enormous amounts of money and people and energy into pursuing that direction as fast as they possibly can. So I think what open source gets you is flexibility and responsiveness. And what closed source gets you is really incredible quality and innovation. And when you bring those two together, you have a pretty awesome set of relationships.
When it comes to data, we keep hearing that AI is going to take away all our jobs.
Yes.
But the quality of AI, I think, critically depends on the quality of data, isn't it? So,
Oh,
can you tell us the interplay between data quality and the results that you get from, let's say, generative AI or deep tech, machine learning, things like that?
absolutely. All AI models are effectively doing the same thing. They are trained on a data set, and that data set can be small or it can be large, but it contains a lot of useful information called features that provides predictive power to the model. So as an example, if I'm Amazon and I want to build a machine learning model that predicts what a customer who is shopping on my website might want to buy next, I would feed lots of information about previous encounters on Amazon into that model so it can train. Like, here's all of the customers over the last 60 days who bought something. Look at their commonalities. Look at all the things, find patterns, create categories. And then once I have that information, the next person who then logs in and is maybe looking at a few different pages on Amazon, the model will say, I recognize those signals from my training data. And because I recognize those signals, I can then look and see what similar customers bought. And now I can recommend those items on the page. And everything from Gen AI to neural nets to whatever follows a similar pattern at the core. Now, the rub is that how good your predictions are is going to be based on the quality of the data that you used for training. If the data that you are feeding into the model is wrong, if it doesn't represent reality, if someone went to Amazon and they bought a product, but the way that Amazon collected that data logged a different product in its system instead of the correct one, then that means that the model is going to learn the wrong thing, and therefore they will make the wrong recommendation. And you can imagine like what happens when these problems start existing at scale, when you have thousands or millions of incorrect data points flooding into these machine learning models or these LLMs. They're going to start being incredibly confident while making the wrong decision. And this is exactly why we haven't seen the full scale adoption of LLMs at corporations trained on their own data. And ultimately, this is what all these big businesses want. ChatGPT, very cool, but it's also very broad and very general. So it's kind of like Google. You can ask it like many general questions, but this isn't really what corporations want to pay for. They want to understand things about their data, about their accounting, their finances, their machine learning, their product team. And in order to do that, they have to provide their data. And if that data is low quality, the LLM is not going to be able to perform to the level that it should. And in some cases, it might be extraordinarily detrimental. Imagine, for example, if the executive asked, hey, ChatGPT or generative AI or whatever, I want you to tell me how many sales have we made over the past 3 months, and what are the most likely customers that we should pursue? If you've got a data quality problem, not only might it tell you the wrong number of sales that you've made over the past 6 months, but it will almost certainly recommend the wrong customers to go after. Now, a human would never do that. A human would be able to simply look at the data, look at the bank statements, talk to customers, and understand which ones are good or bad. But once you've removed the human out of the loop, the AI is free to make bad decisions, to make bad advice if the data itself is low quality and corrupted.
Very true. But there's also this thing called synthetic data. And a lot of people think that if we don't have enough good data, you just add on some synthetic data. Can you get into that a little bit?
Yeah. So when I was in high school, I took an economics class. The teacher said there's no such thing as a free lunch. And that basically means that if someone gives you a sandwich or someone gets a lunch for you, the lunch isn't free. Someone somewhere had to pay for it. Someone had to make it. Someone had to sacrifice their time. The raw materials had to come from somewhere as well. So while it may look free to you, it is not free. It's impossible that it's free. And synthetic data is a theoretical free lunch. The whole point of an artificial intelligence system is that you can understand the real world effectively, and you can make predictions on the real world based on that data. Now, synthetic data is saying we don't need to understand the real world. We can make up data. We can derive data based on what we already have. A machine can generate it. And now we can make predictions based on this machine generated data. That's a free lunch. There are still studies being done on the effects of synthetic data. I've read a few that have differing conclusions. I've read some that have said it's possible, there is some value that could add. I have read others that have said after the third or fourth training generation on synthetic data, the hallucinations of the model are overwhelming. The model essentially becomes completely corrupted very, very quickly. What I would guess is that as teams start to train more on synthetic data, I think it will totally break down. I do not think that synthetic data will be valuable as a training mechanism for AI. I think it will be the inverse of that. It will be better to have a smaller amount of high quality data that is collected from the source that represents reality. And I think businesses are going to move away from trying to collect as much data as possible to trying to collect good data, regardless of how much of it they have. And I think the models will become better in making interpretations and deductions from a smaller amount of higher quality data than constantly needing massive data sizes. I think that's the direction we're going in.
You've worked on social media, you've done a lot of analytics work on social media too. In your opinion, what are the ethical and social responsibilities of social media platforms?
There was a point in time when internet businesses, especially social media businesses, were treated and acted the same as a company that sold a pair of shoes or sold plywood. They were just vending a service that other people could pay for, and it would benefit them or it would not benefit them. The problem, though, is that over the last couple decades, our understanding of psychology has improved, specifically in the way that people are affected by these platforms. Someone's self-esteem on Instagram can be affected if they see many people who are beautiful living these incredible lavish lives that they don't have. It can lead to a semi addiction if you're posting updates and features and you're constantly getting notified and being interacted with, and you get a lot of social validation that way. There were features that were launched back then and they got a ton of engagement, a lot of excitement, but no one really sat down and said, why are these things happening? Like, why are our customers interacting with this content as much as they are? And what they realized as they did start to ask those questions is it was taking advantage of the human psyche. And it was taking advantage of our biology. So it was hardwiring our brains in many cases to act against their best interest. And that makes social media a pretty unique type of business. There's not many other business types out there that have the ability on a mass scale to cause such damage by exploiting human psychology. My personal opinion, and I know a lot of people will not agree with me, is I think that these tools need to be regulated in the same way that we regulate other highly addictive substances. Right? We regulate cigarettes, we regulate alcohol, we have drug regulation, and that's because people don't follow your standard logical thought processes if they're drunk or if they're addicted to cigarettes. It is a mind-altering substance. And I think that social media and how it affects psychology can also be mind altering, and therefore I feel it should be subject to regulation as well.
You have done all kinds of interesting things in your life, including reality TV in Asia and Southeast Asia. In what ways did that mold your life, and how did it help you or change you as a person?
Many ways. The first is when I was working in Southeast Asia and specifically in China, I was writing for a reality television show that focused on sports. And in China, there are not a massive amount of professional athletes, at least at that point in time, did not have the same degree of professional athletics as the United States and other countries that maybe play football or basketball. And so if you are pursuing a professional sports career in China, and specifically the type of sport that I covered, which was martial arts, you were usually very poor. Oftentimes, you are coming from like Inner Mongolia. You were very rarely a like Shanghai native, only sometimes a Beijing native. And so I was spending a lot of time not in the foreigner-friendly areas of China. I was more going to the outskirts of Beijing and Qingdao and talking to people who were pursuing this dream. And you realize the coming up as a sheltered American who had a middle class life. My mom was a middle school teacher. My dad was a high school teacher. We were by no means extraordinarily wealthy, but they did a really good job sort of raising me. We were in a solid middle class neighborhood. You realize how hard the world can be for lots of people, and how lucky and amazing it is to be able to work in technology where I have an air conditioned office and I can work from my desk and I can type things for a living and I can be paid more money than 99.9% of the world. That adds a tremendous amount of perspective, I think, to see those things. And it's also inspiring to see how someone with so few opportunities works so hard. A lot of the folks that I worked with and spent a lot of time with put an enormous amount of effort and time into a discipline that had a relatively low likelihood of success. Martial arts is super intensive and hard on the body. It's like every day, 2 hour training in the morning, 2 hour training in the evening, go home, sleep all night, wake up, do it again, and then do longer training on the weekends, run 5 miles one day, run 5 miles another day. It's absolutely brutal, and the pace is very low. That's inspiring to see people put in so much effort and work so hard for such an uncertain outcome. So that's been really influential to me as well. So I try to practice discipline and understanding what my position is, keeping my current place in life in perspective where everyone else is in the world.
That's amazing. Tell us a little bit about your new venture, Gable.ai, and what's unique about it and what inspired you to start this.
I've been working in data for the last decade. And something that I have always been passionate about, like I mentioned, is infrastructure. I think fixing infrastructure results in the greatest net positive for everyone involved. It was so interesting being at Convoy and seeing so much innovation happen all around me. We were shipping machine learning models left, right, and center. We had all these incredible innovative elements of freight technology that were getting published left, right, and center. And yet the data, which was unbelievably useful and critical to the company, was still so poor that it prevented a lot of these incredible initiatives from really taking off the way that the company had wanted. And we're starting to see something similar now with artificial intelligence. There's all of this promise of what AI can do for the world that has become mainstream talking point. It will be able to cure cancer. It will be able to help regulate the weather. It will cure people's addictions. This utopian-esque aspect to AI. But like I mentioned earlier, an artificial intelligence system is only going to be as good as the data that is trained on. So all of this incredible optimistic future that people are planning for will only happen if the underlying data set is high quality enough to facilitate the AI acting in the expected manner. That is the problem that I am devoting the next 10 or so years of my life to fixing. We think that the biggest hurdle to having trustworthy, high quality data stems from the source. Data moves in a variety of places. It starts by being generated from some source location that could be a patient in a hospital getting diagnosed for treatment, and that is sent over the wire as an EMR record. It could be someone taking a picture on their iPhone, and that picture is stored as a file in the Google Drive somewhere. It could be a record in a transactional database anytime a new user subscribes to an application. At the source is where the data is generated. And this source is where data quality is cared about the least. So software engineers and the teams who are managing data entry, they're usually not thinking about how that data could be useful for AI teams and ML teams and analytics teams. And that's really what our product is about, is not doing really anything that is unbelievably, indescribably technical. We're simply connecting the two sides at the right moment in time. We're helping the software teams and the people who create the data, we call them data producers, understand what the data consumers expect and help the consumers of the data, the ones that are building these AI systems, better understand the data that they're using. And we think if we can do that job very well, then we'll be able to help AI achieve its promise, even if it's by a few percentage points.
I look at your career, Chad, you've done so many interesting things. It's almost like a dream come true, from being a journalist, from doing reality TV, creative writing, and now tech companies, deep tech. Which part of the journey did you learn the most and was the most interesting or maybe even challenging part of your journey?
I know which was the most challenging. My time in Southeast Asia was the most challenging. Fingers crossed, but starting a company doesn't even compare to that. If you sort of come up working in technology, that was not my life in journalism. It was very sort of old school. The owners of these companies were sort of very rough people from before a time where Singapore had transformed into the law-abiding city-state that it is. So it was kind of a bygone era. And there's a lot of crazy things. I saw people in the office get threatened to have their legs broken, and people get beaten up and punched in the face. It's crazy stuff that if you're working at like Snapchat or Google, that would probably be traumatizing to see things like that. And that was every day of my life for 3 years. So that was a really difficult time. What I learned the most during that time was more of what I'm personally capable of, like what are my limitations and what am I good at, and what can I do when I'm really pushed to the limit. While the company that I'm working at now, it's certainly a lot easier physically. I'm not like worried about being abducted at any point in time. I think the challenge is more mental and strategic, right? Like how far in advance can you plan? How effective are your plans? How well can you communicate with very smart people who are all around you? And how can you move this machine, coordinate it so that it produces an output that has never existed? That's a very different type of challenge and requires learning very different types of things. So I think the short answer to your question is, I don't think I can pick a point where I learned more or less. I just learned different things. Although I will say, I really prefer learning things while starting a business than having my life threatened or something.
That's the reason many people come to the United States. A lot of the variables are out, and you can focus on creating good tech or do good service. Speaking of which, what advice do you have for people like you who may have dabbled around in various areas of liberal arts and creative arts, then want to do something in technology? What are the challenges and what's the best approach to get into this?
A couple of things that I would advise. One is don't try to compete with specialists in the area that they specialize in. I've seen so many liberal arts folks who have backgrounds in English or history or something like that try to go out and become a 10x engineer. Usually there's a reason that you pick that major. I'm not saying that you can't do it necessarily, but it's oftentimes because that person is more inclined to softer skills. They're inclined to being very good at language, with communicating with people, having a great sort of understanding of recognizing patterns of behavior, right? Like these skills are important, and they can make you unique when attempting to get a job in the market, and you should lean into them instead of lean away from them. Netflix has a mission statement or something about this, which is like, as a company, think of yourself as a member of a basketball team. And when you're playing on a basketball team, everybody has a role. And if you're Steph Curry and you're unbelievable at shooting 3-point shots, tomorrow you're not going to try to become this defensive juggernaut that's jumping in the air and blocking LeBron James. And they have literal physical limitations that prevent them from doing that. But like Steph Curry is able to excel because he understands what he's good at and he can lean into that. And I think this is something that humanities majors don't do enough. They don't lean into the things where they have skills. So for me, as an example, my skills are storytelling. I'm really good at translating very complex technical subjects in a way that anybody reading can understand. I'm a very good communicator. I know how to do research. I did this as a journalist. I know how to talk to people and extract meaningful answers from them. And I know how to write very, very quickly. When I was in journalism, I would write 3 or 4 articles a day at some points, which is crazy, but I would write that much. And so if I really want to add a tremendous amount of value in the tech space, then I should figure out how that combination of skills can be applied to technology effectively. So I think that's my number one piece of advice for folks in the liberal arts space is don't try to compete with engineers and computer scientists that have been doing this their entire life. Lean into the things that you are good at and find a place for yourself there.
Having worked in technology, I think for almost a decade now, are you the same Chad or have you changed having worked in tech?
I'm more or less the same. I definitely have ideas that have changed. I have opinions about tech and about people who use tech that have changed. But the goals that I had when I got into technology haven't really changed at all. I've been following a relatively straight path for the last decade. I've wanted to do my own company eventually. I wanted to find a big problem to be solved. I wanted to play into my strengths and my skills. I wanted to learn a lot of new things, and I've been able to do all of that pretty consistently. I definitely have grown like anyone else, I think, that's grown over a decade-long period, but I think who I am fundamentally is still the same person.
Chad, clearly you're a role model for many people who may aspire to get into the field of technology and contribute in a way that plays into their strengths, as you said. And that's the reason I talk to people with varied backgrounds who have done different things in different parts of the world. So, to all those who are listening and watching right now, please come forward. I want to hear your stories. I want to know what you're doing. I want to know what's the future that we are all co-creating together. There's no formula to predict the future except to listen to you all. And Chad, may you continue this glorious journey. You've done so many things. I know you'll continue on this creative path.
Thank you. Great chatting.